everyone, Miss Larson here with your first of 3 videos about the animal kingdom. In our first video, we'll take a look at some different animals that are some of the more simple organisms within the animal kingdom. In the next video, we'll look at some more complex ones. And then in our third and final video, we'll look at the most complex animals of the animal kingdom. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at the animals, and we are going to be talking about animals in the context of some of the vocabulary we discussed last week, like symmetry and cephalization and circulatory system. And those vocabulary words that we learned last week can actually help us to group animals into different groups, like into their different phyla or into their different classes. So let's take a look at some different groups of animals. The first group I want us to look at is called Porifera, which means sponges. And you can see some examples of different marine sponges there in the picture. And here is a bunch of information about sponges. So as you can see from the picture, sponges are asymmetrical. There is no symmetry. They get their nutrients by filter feeding because, as you can see, they are stuck in one place. They cannot get up and walk around the ocean floor to find more food. They are sessile, and so they are stuck in one place. That means they're going to wait for the water to filter through them, and they're going to be able to obtain nutrients that way. They do their respiration, which is how they get oxygen, their circulation, which is how they move oxygen around their bodies, and their excretion, which is how they get rid of waste, all by diffusion. They just diffuse the leftover materials into the water. They do not have any sort of nervous system. They are sessile. You can see they can't move around. And they can reproduce either sexually or asexually. If they're asexually reproducing, that just means some sponge breaks off from one sponge and grows in a new location. But if it's sexual, that's where the sponges actually release sperm and egg into the water, which meets up in the current of the water and helps them reproduce. An example is the red boring sponge, which is Cleona celata. That's the scientific name for it. Remember, those scientific names are based in Latin. An interesting fact that you should know is that sponges are the simplest organisms in the whole animal kingdom. And you can see that here. Like, asymmetry is a sign that it's simple. Filter feeding is a very simple way to get food. Diffusion is a very simple way to get rid of your waste and to get new materials into your body. And having no nervous system at all or response, not being able to move, sessile, those are very simple, and that's sponges. Next up, we have corals, jellies, and anemones. The scientific word for corals, jellies, and anemones is cnidarians. So the C is silent there. It's pronounced cnidarians. So you see anemones. These are some different types of coral. This is brain coral. This is staghorn coral. And this is an anemone. And then this is actually a jellyfish. That's a box jellyfish. So those are kind of intimidating. But overall, cnidarians tend to have radial symmetry, which means you could go around a circle and to be able to divide them around a circle. They are getting their nutrients. They're carnivores. Most of them eat little bits of marine life from the ocean current that flows through. Some of them, like some of the jellies, are actually able to sting fish and then bring that to their kind of mouth-ish opening and be able to consume those fish. Cnidarians are kind of simple like sponges are. They do their respiration, circulation, and excretion all through diffusion. So that means they get their oxygen by doing diffusion, they move oxygen around their body by doing diffusion, and they get rid of waste by doing diffusion. They have a nerve net, so they have some nerves in their bodies, but they have no cephalization. Like, they don't have any sort of brain or concentration of nerves within their body. And most of them can detect light and gravity, which helps them in the marine ecosystem. Their movement, a lot of them are motile, like jellyfish. You can tell that they can actually move around the ocean. And a lot of them that are motile use a hydrostatic skeleton, which means they just kind of pump water to help them move. Though some of them, like the anemones and the coral, are sessile and they don't move, many of the jellyfish are motile. They reproduce either asexually by budding or sexually through external fertilization. And what that means is that they don't have like eggs that stay within them, or they don't lay eggs outside of their body. But what happens is they actually would just release egg and sperm into the water, and then they hope that through the current moving around in the ocean that those egg and sperm come in contact with each other and are able to be fertilized. An example is a box jellyfish, and there's a scientific name for that. And an interesting fact is that jellyfish can still sting you even when they're dead. Next up, we have our flatworms. These guys are kind of interesting. Some of them are parasites, like this one that's in an intestinal tract. That's a flatworm. This is a planaria. They live in water. And then these are some other marine flatworms. And these marine flatworms are actually really kind of beautiful. They're not parasitic, but some are parasites. Another name for flatworms is Platyhelminthes. So if you see Platyhelminthes, that means flatworms. These flatworms are the first organisms to have bilateral symmetry rather than radial. That means you could split them in two, and you can kind of see that there in the pictures. They can be many different types of heterotrophs. Some of them are carnivores, some of them are detritivores, and others are parasites, like I mentioned, this one that is in someone's intestines. They do their respiration, which means getting oxygen through diffusion. They move oxygen around their body or do circulation by diffusion, but they actually have a little bit more advanced excretion system. They have these things called flame cells that help them get rid of extra water. Their nervous system is a lot more complex than our sponges and cnidarians. These guys have eye spots, so they're actually able to detect light, and you can see those eye spots right there on the planaria. You can see they would be at the front here of that marine flatworm. They can reproduce, or actually, sorry, I skipped their movement. They are motile, and some of them have muscle cells, and others have cilia, which are like little projections from their body that help them move in their environment. Reproduction can be sexual or asexual. So some of them, like the planaria, you can actually split in two and they can regenerate. So that's asexual reproduction. But sexual reproduction is when two have to actually come in contact with each other. And many of them are hermaphrodites, just like snails, which means they have both male and female parts. So they can reproduce pretty easily. Example is a European planaria, and there's a scientific name. And an interesting fact about flatworms, an example is tapeworm too, and that can be avoided. Like this is a tapeworm in someone's intestines, but you could avoid getting a tapeworm in your intestines by cooking your meat thoroughly when you're going to be eating it. Next up, we've got roundworms. These are also known as nematodes or nematoda. Roundworms are a lot of times parasites. So this is one that would be an intestinal parasite that could be in someone's intestines. A lot of times it'll be in like a dog or a cat. And this is a roundworm that's actually become a parasite to a human and is in that human's eye. Roundworms have bilateral symmetry, just like the flatworms did, and bilateral symmetry is the most complex type of symmetry. So we've gotten into more complex organisms when we're talking about flatworms and roundworms. These roundworms can be parasites, and a lot of them are parasites, but others can just be omnivores, herbivores, and detritivores. These guys have simple respiration, circulation, and excretion. That's all done through diffusion, but they do have cephalization, which means that they have a concentration of nerves at the front of their body, and they actually have nerves that extend from the front to the back of their body. It's a little bit more complex than flatworms. They are motile, and they have these long muscles throughout their bodies, and they can move in a snake-like motion. Roundworms all reproduce sexually, and sexual reproduction is more complex than asexual reproduction, because in sexual reproduction, you're able to actually exchange genetic materials with other organisms of your species, whereas in asexual, you're just kind of splitting in two. An example of a roundworm is a human whipworm, which is a parasite. You can see its scientific name there. And also, fun fact, interesting fact, is that roundworms have a pseudocoelom. So we talked about coeloms, and we said that that's that layer between your skin and your intestines. It's kind of that middle part of your body that contains all the rest of your organs. And roundworms don't have a fully developed coelom, but they have a pseudocoelom, so kind of like an almost a coelom. The last ones I want to talk about today in our presentation is, in this video, is segmented worms, and those are also known as annelids. So if you see annelids, that means segmented worms. Those include earthworms, like you might go fishing with, leeches, like that one there, and those tend to suck blood to be able to get their nutrients. And then also there are many different marine segmented worms. You can see them there. They're able to swim, and they are really kind of beautiful segmented worms. If of all the segmented worms, I think these are the coolest looking. So annelids or segmented worms have bilateral symmetry. They can be filter feeders, detritivores, or carnivores, and they do have a very simple digestive system, which is more complex than some of our other organisms we've looked at. These guys actually have a fully developed, not fully, but it's a fairly well-developed intestinal tract. So they have a digestive system. It's not as advanced as like humans, of course, but they have more of a digestive system than the other organisms, which pretty much did their digestion through diffusion. Annelids can have gills. Some of them actually have gills to obtain oxygen, and then many of them still do rely on having moist skin to do diffusion of oxygen into their body. Their circulatory system is fairly advanced. It is a closed circulatory system, which means that they do have blood vessels like arteries and veins. They have a complex excretion system, which is involving certain cells called nephridia, and they're kind of like the kidneys of an earthworm or of an annelid, and they help filter the fluid. Annelids have a brain and cephalization. They have a pretty well-developed nervous system compared to the other organisms we've talked about. They are able to move. Most of them are motile. They have two different types of muscles, longitudinal and circular, which allows them to move their body in the way that you think of a worm moving their body. Most of their reproduction is sexual, and some are hermaphrodites. So many earthworms like these are actually hermaphroditic. So that means that as long as one earthworm meets up with another earthworm, they could both fertilize each other and reproduce that way. Examples of annelids are the red wriggler worm, which most people use for fishing. You can see the scientific name there. And an interesting fact is that leeches are an example of annelids. They're actually fairly closely related to wriggler worms, and they can suck blood, and some doctors have even used them to prevent swelling in some people who have had too much swelling in their bodies due to too much blood being in the area. Thanks so much for listening. Tune into video 2.